大家好，歡迎收睇哲學係咁傾。咁我係今集嘅主持朱文。咁好耐冇見啦，我哋哲學係咁傾翻嚟啦。咁咧希望大家多多支持啦。我哋都終於決定咧要重啟呢個系列啦。咁點解咧？就因為今日咧我哋實在邀請咗一位非常重量嘅嘉賓，咁就不得不咧今集咧一定要拍一拍，同大家傾下哲學，等大家重拾呢個節目嘅熱情啊！咁喺介紹呢位重量級嘉賓之前咧，我就好快介紹我哋今日一齊傾嘅主持。咁就有嗰邊嘅清楠啦，好 feel 到係非常之緊張嘅大家。亦都有呢邊嘅 MK 啦，MK 老師萬琪係。
I'm Mankey。
Yes， 係啦。咁咧係呢幾十秒咧，就係呢一集最後講廣東話嘅時間啦。因為咧，我哋呢位重量級嘉賓咧係唔識講廣東話嘅，而呢位重量級嘉賓咧係非常之榮幸啦。因為其實我哋喺唔同嘅集數或者我哋嘅片入邊咧，都提及到唔少次呢個名字嘅。咁我哋今日嘅嘉賓咧就係 Peter Singer 啦。So today we have a really truly special guest, Professor Singer, and then Professor Singer, I think our audience know you already because we have mentioned your name, your philosophy many times in different episodes. So it is a truly pleasure, honor to have you here. So Professor Singer is like one of the most influential living philosophy of our day. So you make many major voices on different issues regarding like utilitarian and like animal ethics, bioethics, and also effective altruism. So it is our true honor to have you here. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, G-Man. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So what a milestone for us. Okay, so we are so nervous. So before we go deep into utilitarianism and philosophy, maybe we can begin with some rather personal story. We want to know more about your personal journey to philosophy and also utilitarianism. So may I ask, what is your motivation or your starting point of studying philosophy? When and why are you interested in philosophy?
Well, I didn't know much about philosophy when I was applying to go to university. Okay. Philosophy was not taught in high schools in Australia at that time. Okay. So the little bit that I knew about it, I got from the boyfriend of my sister. I had a sister older than me, and he had done some philosophy, and somehow or other we talked about it. I'd also read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which was really the only philosophy book that I'd read. But it seemed interesting. I'd always been interested in a good argument, and I was planning to study law because lawyers have to be good at arguing.
You can make money out of
and you can make a living from it, that's right. So when I I applied for law, I was accepted to study law, but I went to see a counsellor who looked at my results for my final year of high school, and he said, you've done well in a number of humanities subjects. You might consider combining the law degree with a Bachelor of Arts degree, which you can do. It doesn't takes 1 or 2 years longer, depending how long, whether you do an honours arts degree or just an ordinary one. And so I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm happy to do that. So what would I study in the arts degree? I'd done history at school and like that, so I said I'll do history, but then I wanted to do something else as well. So I decided to try the first year philosophy course. And I enjoyed that, and I did well in it. So I went on with philosophy, and I became more interested in the philosophy than in the law subjects, which I was studying at the same time. So there was a point at which I'd finished the philosophy degree and got a first-class honours result in it, but I hadn't finished the law degree. So I went to the law school and said, philosophy is encouraging me to go on and do a master's degree in philosophy. Can I postpone finishing the law degree? And they said, sure, no problem, you can postpone for a couple of years.
Is it postpone or cancel?
At the time it was postponed because you just said I can earn some money as a lawyer, and I didn't know I could earn some money as a philosopher. And in fact my father really doubted that I
For some
could
philosopher, not all.
My father said, philosopher, how can you make a living as a philosopher? But I did the master's degree, I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, I did the graduate degree. By that time, I was interested in a career in philosophy, and I never finished the law degree.
There are many different kind of philosophical questions, like metaphysics, like philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and some are more practical, like ethics, in which you are specialties. So my question is, are you concerned about moral philosophy since you start doing philosophy, or you are more like interested in all kind of philosophy since then?
I was interested in the whole area of philosophy at first, but when it came to thinking about maybe I'm going to spend my life doing this, I didn't think that I could really feel good spending my life asking questions like, how do I know that I'm not dreaming now, right?
Okay.
That didn't seem a very real concern. It was sort of an intellectual puzzle, how I might know that. But that and other questions of that kind, they seemed a little bit too remote from ordinary life. And I liked the idea that in ethics, you can talk about issues that other people do talk about. And hopefully you can add to the quality of the discussion by having some philosophy background. So that's why by the final years of my philosophy, I was more interested in ethics and political philosophy than I was in metaphysics or epistemology or logic.
But do you have an expectation that you want to make a real influence in the real world while doing philosophy when you start interested in ethics?
Perhaps not at first, but gradually as I'd done some more ethics. And also the other thing that I should say is I'm an undergraduate in the 1960s. It was a decade of new student movements. There was the war in Vietnam. Australia was an ally of the United States. We actually had troops in Vietnam fighting alongside the United States. It was possible that I was going to be conscripted to fight in Vietnam. That was a possibility given the age that I was. So I was interested in that issue, and there was a lot of discussion in the universities about, is this a just war? What are the criteria for a just war? And there was also the civil rights movement in America, which spread to Australia as well. So that was another question with moral issues that were being raised by students, and students were talking about, why aren't our courses more relevant to this, right? Why, for example, in ethics, are we only analysing the meanings of moral words and asking whether they're objective or subjective or emotive? Why aren't we asking these questions like, what are the criteria for a war to be just? What is the basis of human equality? So I did think, because of that time at which I was studying, that, yeah, ethics might have something to do that's relevant to our lives. And that
So you
was
were kind of triggered by the social environment, the atmosphere, so that you are more interested in ethics, which is more down to earth and relevant to the real world.
That's right. I think it was probably a combination of my own temperament and also what was going on at the time in social movements.
In talking about ethics, I think you are one of the most famous utilitarian in the world. So may I ask further, when and why you start to be a utilitarian?
Well, the first ethics course that I took was taught by a professor called H.J. McCloskey. He's probably not heard of much today, but he was an intuitionist along the lines of W.D. Ross. So he thought the right view of morality is that we intuit a number of prima facie duties, like the duty of
Not lying, not killing, something like that?
Yeah, not lying, that's right, veracity, gratitude. If someone did something good to you, you had a duty to be grateful and to return the favor if the opportunity arose. Reparation, if you harmed somebody, you had a duty to make it up to them. Beneficence, so there was a duty of doing good, but it was only one among several duties. And non-maleficence, not harming people, was another. So, and he actually was, I think, the author of one of the, at least at that time, famous objections to utilitarianism. The objection was based on the assumption that you are the sheriff in a southern town. At this time, the South was quite racist still. And in this town, a white woman says she's been raped by a black man. And there's a mob of people who've gone out with guns, and they've rounded up half a dozen black men, and they're now about to lynch them all as a sort of warning to the black community. And so these 6 people are going to be killed. What can you do as sheriff? Well, you can't stop them entirely from doing this, but if you say, I've got evidence that this one is the one who did it, then they will lynch that one and let the others go. And McCloskey said, well, a utilitarian would have to do that. A utilitarian would have to say, make false evidence, try to forge the evidence to show that one man was guilty, so that only one person would die rather than 6. So it's kind of a version of the trolley problem, as you can see. And McCloskey thought that this was a knockdown objection to utilitarianism, because obviously a sheriff should not invent evidence. A sheriff should be honest and do their role, even if that meant that more people died. And I was not convinced by that. I thought, gee, you know, if there's really nothing the sheriff can do to stop 6 people being lynched, at least 5 of whom are innocent, except by telling a lie, well, that's what he should do. So I thought, well, that's not a knockdown objection to utilitarianism. What are the other objections that some people think are knockdown objections? And I started looking at the literature, and I didn't think any of the objections were really convincing. Okay. So then I began to think, well, maybe there is something in this theory.
Okay, so it's like the classic scapegoat objection to utilitarianism. I personally don't find it lockdown argument, but at least I will recognize some appeal of the argument. So you never shared our intuition that the sheriff shouldn't make up the evidence and kill one bad guy. You never had that intuition.
I never had that intuition as an overriding intuition.
Okay.
I could understand the sort of the attraction of the view that, you know, there's something bad about a government official, a law official in particular, forging the evidence. I could see that often that might lead to very bad things happening, but I never thought that intuition is just so powerful that that's the end of utilitarianism, that utilitarianism must be wrong.
Okay, so...
I actually want to ask, how do you start your journey into animal ethics? Because we can discuss utilitarianism in the next session. So I'm interested in your
have a section for animal ethics. Yeah.
Right, but I want to talk about his personal journey.
My personal journey to animal ethics. Okay, so that happened some years later, because what I was just talking about was in the second year of my university degree. That would have been 1965. I completed the Bachelor of Arts degree. I completed the master's degree. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford. I went to Oxford in 1969. And in 1970, I was in a class about freedom and responsibility taught by Jonathan Glover. I don't know if you've mentioned Jonathan Glover in this program, but
not sure.
He's a philosopher who I really liked his work. Some of the things that he did were looking at applied ethics. He's one of the early people to do that. He wrote a book called Causing Death and Saving Lives, which I think was really one of the very good early books in ethics. But this particular class that I was attending was on free will and responsibility, right? You know, the argument, well, if determinism is true, there's no moral responsibility because everything we do is determined. It was a fairly small class, so plenty of time for discussion. And in one of the classes, I asked a question. I can't now remember what the question was about, but it started some thread of discussion. And after the class was over, a Canadian student who was in the class, who I'd seen but never talked to, came up to me and said, "What did you think of Glover's answer to your view?" And I said, well, I didn't really think that he fully answered my objection. And Richard said, turned out his name was Richard Keshen. Richard said, "Yeah, I think you're maybe right about that. Would you like to come and talk about this over lunch?" So as Oxford students, we had a college to go to where we ate lunch, and I went to Balliol College with Richard. And at that time, when you came in for lunch, there was one hot dish, and the only alternative to the hot dish was a cold salad plate. So Richard looked at the hot dish, which was spaghetti with a kind of brown sauce on top of it, and he said, is there meat in that sauce? And he was told there was, so he took the salad plate. And I noticed that because it was, was wondering what his problem was with meat. There were no vegetarians who I knew, nobody that I had met in my entire undergraduate studies, I think, or my first year at Oxford was a vegetarian. It just didn't happen really, except perhaps for an Indian who was vegetarian for Hindu sort of reasons. So we finished the discussion about free will and responsibility, and then I said, so why did you ask about the meat? Don't you eat meat? Why, if so, why not? And Richard said something pretty simple like, I don't think it's right to treat animals the way they get treated to be turned into meat. And I said, well, what's so wrong with it? Don't they, they're out in the fields, they're grazing, they don't have any predators. Yes, I know they get trucked to slaughter and killed, but that's only one bad day and what seems a reasonably good life to me. And he said, no, you're wrong. A lot of these animals that we're eating are
Horrible life.
yeah, they have horrible lives. They're inside. They don't get to go outside at all, or they don't get to go on grass. They're very closely confined, and it's all just directed at producing the meat as cheaply as possible. I was a bit surprised because I really didn't know that, and Richard referred me to a book, the only book that was around about factory farming. It was called Animal Machines, written by Ruth Harrison, and it was a pioneering study of what was happening to farming, and it quoted extensively from farming magazines, so it wasn't just her personal opinion. She backed it up by showing that this is what the official advice to farmers or the commercial production advice to farmers was, how to treat their animals, how many chickens you can fit into a cage for egg-laying hens, how densely you can pack the pigs into a shed. And I was surprised and disturbed. Pretty shocked, yeah. I think shocked is the right word.
So do I when I first look at the documentary about factory farming.
Right, yeah. Well, I didn't know of any documentaries then, but there were some photos in the book too, actually, and they were pretty powerful.
So you first become a utilitarian and then become a vegan. Do you find it is a intellectual development from your utilitarian principle
I think it was to some extent. So when I started after looking at Ruth Harrison's book, I started thinking about, well, is there perhaps something that still justifies us in treating animals in this way? And I looked at various writers who did justify treating animals. There weren't very many actually who even addressed the issue, but there were some. Thomas Aquinas said, well, God has given us dominion over the animals. Okay, well, I was not religious. I was an atheist by this time. That wasn't going to persuade me. Of course, famously, Descartes said the animals are automata, they don't feel anything. That was completely implausible, I thought. Kant said we don't have duties to animals because they're not self-aware, conscious beings, but I thought, well, surely their suffering matters, even if they're not self-aware. So these all seemed like excuses to going on to eating meat. And yes, and from utilitarianism, it flowed, and in fact, the early utilitarians did say that, if animals feel pain and suffering, that counts in some way. Okay. So I think the fact that I was a utilitarian made it much easier for me to say, oh, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this, than if I had been a Kantian or something. I might have thought, well, the great Immanuel Kant, he thinks it's because they're not self-conscious, maybe there's something in that.
Although nowadays many Kantian Aristotelians try to argue for the vegan position as well from their understanding of morality.
Yes, well, they certainly argue that factory farming is wrong, and yes, it's been good to see, like Christine Korsgaard oppose factory farming and the way we treat animals, and Martha Nussbaum from the Aristotelian perspective, absolutely. So it's different now, very different. I mean, now there's a big philosophical literature on animal ethics, but there really wasn't anything at the time. You had to go back a long way. There'd been a big gap. If you went back to the late 19th century, there was a work by a man called Henry Salt, who was not an academic philosopher, but sort of, I guess, a general social reformer would be the best way to describe him. He wrote a book called Animals' Rights in Relation to Social Progress, in which he said that animals should have rights, basically. He said if humans have rights, animals should have rights too.
Okay.
So there was some early work, but, and you can go right back to Plutarch in Roman times and Porphyry, a Hellenistic Greek philosopher. They wrote about abstaining from flesh. But there wasn't anything very much recently at that time.
Thank you. So I think we are just about out of time for this segment. So in the next segment and section, we will go deep into the idea of utilitarianism. So see you next section.
阿仔阿仔，頭先個節目好唔好睇啊？
好好睇啊，爸爸！
頭先個節目免費㗎喎，知唔知我哋要做啲咩呢？
我唔知喎，爸爸。
如果你唔知，我話你知啊！我哋不如加入 Patreon 會員，每個月少少嘅月費就可以支持更加美滿嘅節目㗎啦！
哇！咁我大個一定要好似豬麻哥咁入牛津賺多啲錢啊！
Okay, so welcome back to our program. So we had just an excellent discussion with your personal journey to philosophy, utilitarian, and veganism. So in this section, we would like to go deep into the idea of utilitarianism, although I think most of our audience already heard of it and have certain level of understanding of it, but would you mind to explain the basic idea of the moral theory of utilitarianism?
Absolutely, it's very straightforward. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. That means it's a theory that says the right action is the one that has the best consequences. What is specific about utilitarianism is that by best consequences, it essentially is talking about well-being, about happiness, and its opposite, suffering. Those are the relevant consequences that make an action good, at least for the classical version of utilitarianism. There are somewhat other interpretations of what our well-being consists in. So it might consist in the satisfaction of our preferences according to some views, or our preferences or our desires. But you can think of it as the view that the right action is the one that does the most to improve well-being for all of those affected by our actions.
Okay, thanks. So today we are going to try to challenge the idea of utilitarianism, although you find all of them are not really compelling, so that you stay in the camp of utilitarianism. So in this section, we will like to discuss one or two of them, which is really famous. So
Yeah.
can Mankey?
Yeah. People often say utilitarianism is too demanding for them. I have two examples, one for trivial action, another for life choice example, I would call it. First of all, let's say today I want to treat myself and buy a cup of bubble tea, all right, and then, all right, I feel good about that, but utilitarian may say that I was doing something wrong. Why? Because I could save up the money and give it to the charity, and probably it ends up saving a life. So actually buying a cup of bubble tea is actually the wrong thing to do. So, but for common people, they would say, wow, that's too demanding. So that's my trivial action example. I have another, which is, I think, more significant, actually, because for many of us, we have so many so-called life projects for each of us, all right? For you to be a philosopher, to be a public intellectual, right? But let's say, let me give a hypothetical example, right? Linda wants to change her job from working as a high-earning banker to, let's say, to a charity officer receiving only a humble income, right? So normally we would think that, oh, that's respectable, actually, right? It reflects your own values. You try to be good, right? Instead of greedy banker, something like that. But we may praise her. But for utilitarian, they may say, wait a minute, right? She could do something wrong because if he changed her job, well, actually he could keep the high-paying job instead of changing her job, because when he continues to work as a banker, he could actually donate a big chunk of her income to a charity again, instead of, actually it could end up saving a lot more people than her working directly in a charitable organization. So again, for utilitarianism, she would have made a wrong life choice, but for most of us, it's fine, it's respectable. So again, these two examples may show that utilitarianism is actually too demanding for common people.
Okay, thanks for the examples. Let's take them in turn. You said that instead of buying the bubble tea, you could donate to a charity and save a life. I don't know where you buy your bubble tea, but GiveWell estimates it takes $4,500 to save a life by providing mosquito nets for people who are otherwise at risk of getting bitten by mosquitoes and dying. So your bubble tea isn't going to make a lot of difference. Of course, if you saved up, if you never bought bubble tea and you saved up for a couple of years what you might spend on bubble tea, then maybe you could save a life. And maybe a utilitarian would say that would be a better thing to do. That's true. So let's ask, is that claim too demanding? Well, it may just be, I mean, yes, to say you shouldn't spend money on any little indulgences like bubble tea or, other larger items, like you shouldn't upgrade your phone when the new iPhone comes out. You should donate that, and that's a more substantial sum. So it's true that that's a very demanding ethic. Now, there's a few things to say about that. It might be that given the world we're in which you can afford to spend some money on bubble tea, and perhaps you can afford to upgrade your phone whenever the new one comes out, whereas other people in this world are living on the equivalent of $2.15 US per day, so less than $1,000 per year. And they may not be able to satisfy their basic needs for adequate food, shelter. They may not be able to educate their children. So perhaps it's just the fact that the world is so unequal, and also, of course, that we now have the ability to transfer some resources from the wealthy nations to the poorer nations, and we have organizations that can effectively do that and can help people in those poorer nations, can save their lives, restore their sight, perform other basic necessary operations, help them to start a business. Maybe it's just that fact about the world, which means that ethics has changed, because now we have the opportunity to help strangers at a great distance, which for most of our evolutionary history we never had. So it strikes us as very demanding, but that's just the objective situation we're in. So that's one thing I'd say about that. Another thing I would say is utilitarians are not unrealistic about human nature, right? We do have an ethic which says you should do what has the best consequences. But we recognize that there are very few saints in the world. You're probably not a saint. So, we're not going to really come down very hard on you for your bubble tea, because we're going to say, well, what do you do for people in poverty, right? Maybe you're already giving something quite significant to help people. Maybe you're giving more than most people give, but you still have enough to have your bubble tea and enjoy it. So I think utilitarians would say, look, that's fine, as long as you're giving something reasonably significant, and perhaps if you become wealthier, you're going to give more, then you're doing something to help people in need. You're perhaps also contributing to raising the standard of giving in your community, because maybe other people in your community give less than you do. So then we're going to say, it's great that you're giving something. I hope that eventually you'll be able to give more, but it's a good thing. So what I'm doing here is I'm separating the question of, are you doing exactly what utilitarianism would say you ought to do? To which the answer is no. And I'm separating that question from the question, should you be blamed for what you're doing? And for utilitarians, the question, who should you blame and who should you praise, is also a question that you answer by utilitarian principles. So you should blame people when it's useful to blame them, when it will lead to good consequences, and you should praise them when it will be useful to praise them. So let's say you're giving, I don't know, 10% of your income to charities, but that still leaves you enough with to buy your bubble tea, then you're certainly going to get praise, because most people in your community and at your wealth level don't give 10%, we'll assume. So that's why I think you can accept the idea. Yes, it's a demanding ethic if you were to follow it in every respect, but not following it in every respect is something that we have to live with. And we have to live with the fact that most people are going to be like that.
All right.
Okay. So then you had the example of Linda, who's the banker earning a lot of money, and she wants to do something that perhaps she thinks is going to be more interesting for her. She wants to go and work for a charity. It's not clear that utilitarianism will say that she's wrong in doing that. It will really depend a lot on the circumstances. So one question is, as a banker, is she giving a lot to charity? How much is she giving to effective charities? If she is, that's good. But also, how badly does the charity need somebody with her talents to work for them? And how effective is the charity? You know, some charities are highly effective. I founded an organization called The Life You Can Save, which recommends about 20-something really effective charities helping people in poverty. But to get to those 20, we had to winnow through a much larger number of ones that are not very effective. But let's say that Linda has actually chosen one of the really effective charities, and that she has the skills to make that charity even more effective. Then it's quite possible that she will do more good working for that charity than she would working as a banker, even if she had then quite a lot of money to give. Because maybe the bottleneck with the charity is not that it can't raise funds, but that it doesn't have the talented staff to work for it. That's possible. But it's also possible that the decision should go the other way. It could be that she has no particular skills that will help the charity, but she's able to earn a lot as a banker, and she's able to resist the temptation to live in the same high expense lifestyle as other bankers at her level, you know, who want to have the latest sports car or live in very flash penthouse apartments. Yeah, it could be that the best thing for her to do is to continue to work as a banker. If she really hates being a banker, she's probably not going to be very successful at it. You know, that would be unusual. And then maybe it's better for her to do what she really would enjoy doing, and she'll probably work harder at that and do more good that way. But it is going to depend very much on the circumstances. And once again, if she's working for the charity and doing good, we're not really going to blame her by saying, oh yes, but you could have done even more good as a banker by donating your salary, because we recognize that people want to do not only the most good, but also something that they find intrinsically interesting to pursue.
Can I add on a follow-up question? Because your response is like distinguishing the blameworthiness and the question of right and wrong. So my follow-up question is like, do you also distinguish between so-called positive and negative duty? Because for most of us, according to our intuition, we have the duty of not hurting, not killing people, not producing suffering. But many people feel like they do not have the duty of maximizing the happiness in the world.
Right.
So do you find the two to be equal, or they are just to the same?
So as a utilitarian, I don't see an intrinsic distinction between the positive and the negative duties. We put that as, you know, the things that you do and the things that you refrain from doing or omit doing. You need to look at the consequences in both cases. So, you know, you might be saying, you know, somebody might say, like, let's go back to Linda. She was earning a lot as a banker. She could have given it away, but let's assume she didn't. So by omission, children died of malaria who would not have died if she had donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and the children had been sleeping under bed nets. Now, does that mean that she was under a duty to give? Well, I would say yes. Is it the same as the duty not to go and murder these children? Well, you know, not exactly, even though the children are dead both ways, I guess, whether they die from malaria or die from being murdered. But obviously, you know, to make the effort to go and murder somebody makes you a different type of person from a person who says, oh, you know, yes, I've got lots of money, but I want to, you know, go to some of these high brand, luxury brand products. I want to carry around this very expensive handbag so all of my friends can see how wealthy I am. You know, that's a failing, I think, but it's not the same as actually going to kill someone. So I think that's why we would distinguish what we say to the agent. Again, you know, whether we condemn them for what they're doing or not, whether we praise them. The distinction you're asking about between positive and negative duties might well be relevant to how we assess the agent, but not relevant to how we assess the action.
And I want to follow up on the idea of like the distinction between blameworthiness and whether the action is right or wrong. So I think, at least from my intuition, I will tend to connect like the idea of blameworthiness to the idea of supererogation. It's like if some action is supererogatory and you do it or not, you're not blameworthy, whether you're doing it or not. So if like under the utilitarian account, so not you're like Linda maybe, perhaps she stayed to be a banker is utility maximizing, but she switched jobs to like charity or some other jobs. We will feel like, I'm not sure how to say it about this, like because on one hand, like she's not doing the right action according to the utilitarian standard, but on the other hand, because I will tend to think utilitarian doesn't have the resources to distinguish between obligatory and supererogatory. So it seems like if the Linda case, she's like we shouldn't blame her for switching her job to some jobs that less utility maximizing. So I'm not sure how to like continue the question.
Yeah.
It's just like we shouldn't blame her, but she's not doing the right thing. It's not even because she's wrong and she's blameworthy.
Yeah, so you're right. The utilitarian does not have this separate category of supererogatory actions because you always ought to do what, to the best of your knowledge, will lead to the most good. Or another way of putting it is to say you always ought to do the action with the highest expected value, where expected value is the value of each outcome multiplied by the probability of achieving that goal. So we wouldn't talk about supererogatory, but again, we might talk about whether Linda has done more than you can expect of people, or as much as one could expect of people in these circumstances, or whether she's done something that falls below the standard of what people in her community and culture might do. And it sounds like in this case that the community would recognize that it's important to people to have a job that interests them intrinsically, that you're not really going to blame somebody for changing jobs even if they can do slightly less good, as long if they're still trying to do some good, you know, and she's going to be working for a charity after all. She'll maybe do less good than a banker, but it's not like she's stopped doing good at all. She's still trying to do something to help people in greater need than she is. So again, that's how I would draw that distinction. I would just say you're not going to blame her for what she's doing, but it's not because of the distinction between what's obligatory and what's supererogatory.
So can I describe your view as a lessening of the classical utilitarianism's requirement? Because usually, as we normally understand it, classical utilitarianism holds that an action is right if and only if it is like happiness or utility maximizing. So what you said seems to be like And actually, this right is not because it doesn't need to be utility maximizing.
No, but Peter didn't said that it is not wrong. It's still wrong.
No, yeah, I
But
was
just like don't want to blame her. Maybe it's counter-effective because from the utilitarian perspective, if you bring Linda, you won't make her doing more good. So it doesn't contradict to the classic utilitarian principle. It's still wrong because it's not in the sense that it's not maximizing the good.
yeah.
But we just don't want to bring her.
That's correct. It's still not the right action.
Yeah.
But there's no justification for blaming her unless blaming her is like to do some good.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in this section we have discussed one of the most common objection to demanding to the utilitarianism, and in the next segment we will continue to talk about different objection to utilitarianism.
舒適嘅質感，通爽透氣，讓你毛孔都可以呼吸，溫柔地包裹你每一寸肌膚，就好似我抱住你一樣。除咗各款 T-shirt， 仲有外套、tote bag、啤牌、書本等各款荼毒室嘅產品。除咗香港本地，而家仲可以海外郵購添，直送到你屋企門口。大家快啲上荼毒室網店選購啦！
Okay, welcome back to our show. So, in the last segment, we have discussed the too demanding objection. In this section, we were going to discuss a objection particular to the classical utilitarian, which is the anti-Hinduistic idea. So, would Cheng Nam introduce the objection to us?
Yes, because like for classical utilitarians, like the only thing that has intrinsic value, the only intrinsic value, so to say, is happiness or pleasure. So it strikes many people as like absurd because
It's too narrow.
too narrow. Because apparently there are a lot of things other than pleasure or happiness understood in this way to be like valuable. For example, we value friendship, we value beauty, we value truth, and the reason why we value those things are not because like they brings us happiness. Like you can imagine like writing a poem. The process of writing may be painful, and like although after finishing a poem, the poet may feel like happy, pleasure, but we can assume that in a lot of cases, the pleasure that the poet gains is not enough to offset the suffering he had during the process of writing. I think like writing a philosophy paper may be the same, at least for me.
I'm sorry you suffer when you write philosophy papers. I wish you were happier.
Not even pleasure gained, only pain.
Like maybe more instrumental, like get a grade, finish a course, etc. But yeah, that's one cases, and maybe we can further assume in those cases that like those readers of the poem may not like their happiness from reading the poem may not be enough to offset like the pain, the suffering he has during the process.
It's also related to a very old objection against classical utilitarians. Like philosopher would say Bentham, which is a classical utilitarian, all right, back in 18th centuries.
Late 18th, early 19th.
Or even older than that. All right. So, they call his utilitarianism, classical utilitarianism, a philosophy of pig. Right. It recommends a life to be pleasurable rather than studying philosophy or
to live a life of
beauty.
pigs, like virtue, beauty, it's not relevant. What's relevant is only pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes. So some people find this like unsatisfactory, at least. Like we have a lot of
Even for some classical utilitarian, like J.S. Mill, we find this kind of objection, philosophy of pigs, kind of reasonable, and so he tried to
distinguish the quality of pleasure.
He distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, yes. I don't think you can really do that and remain a hedonist. I think that was a mistake that Mill made. I think he was too conservative, too eager to conform to the views of his contemporaries, people like Thomas Carlyle, who I think used this philosophy of swine objection, and he didn't want to seem to be anti-intellectual. I think Bentham was much more honest. You know, Bentham had this famous saying regarding your poet. He said, pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin was a game that you played in pubs in England. It was a rather simple game, but I think the full quotation is, quantities of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. Now, of course, that's a caveat, which means, you know, maybe quantities of pleasure in the long run are not going to be equal. Maybe pushpin will get boring if you keep playing it every Friday night in the pub, and eventually you'll want something more varied, you know, and poetry may bring you some greater pleasures. So, but Bentham's view would be, it is whatever gives you greater pleasure. So Bentham, I think, is a true hedonist. Mill, I think, says that he's a hedonist, but actually doesn't stick to it when it comes to the crunch.
Very few times I first heard of Mill being too conservative, because most of the time people will praise him as a radical, dare to change the convention.
Well, in some respects, of course, that's true, and his great work on the subjection of women was a very radical and progressive work for the time. But I think he really, you know, well, perhaps conservative wasn't quite the right term, but wanting to conform to the intellectual milieu of his day.
I agree with Singer.
Revisionary enough. Is it the right term?
Not revisionary enough. Yes, that's right. Yes,
Yeah, I agree with Singer, because as far as I know, J.S. Mill actually even at some point defend colonialism, right?
Okay.
So,
he worked for the India office.
Yeah,
Yes, he was he spent
so,
most of his working life, you know.
So when compared to Bentham,
Okay.
he's much more conservative.
I think Bentham was more revisionary in your term, more ready to
So
make
what
change.
about the question?
The question.
Yes. Do you
I
think
can't-
it's
I
too
can't
narrow set
evade the
of
question.
Do you think
intrinsic
it's,
value?
Yeah, this objection succeed, or how can a utilitarian accommodate such objections, like the value?
Well, the utilitarian will disagree with or the hedonistic utilitarian at least, will disagree with what you said about these other things being intrinsically good. You know, utilitarians will generally say, yes, you know, truth is good. What were your other examples? Friendship is good, beauty. But they will say they're good because they contribute to happiness, and I would say, you know, happiness in the broadest sense, right? And that's the problem with the philosophy of pigs objection, right? For humans anyway, there are more ways to get pleasure than wallowing in the mud. And I suppose more ways to get pleasure than having sex, which is another pleasure that presumably pigs have as well. But we also get pleasure from intellectual pursuits, from, I would think a poet would normally get pleasure from creating a poem that really works, that is a poem of high quality. Friendship is, I think, essential to a happy human life. You know, we are social mammals. I think there's very few humans who can really live and be happy without loving and caring relationships with other humans. So I think friendship has great value, but again, I think it's instrumental value. Beauty is an interesting example because G.E. Moore at one stage made the objection to hedonism that he asked the reader to imagine two possible worlds. One of them, the most beautiful world you can imagine. You know, I guess you can think of gorgeous mountains and lakes and spectacular views. And the other, he says, I think just one heap of filth. I don't quite know what he was imagining as filth, but anyway, you know, very, I guess you could think of it as a rundown building site or something like that. I don't know. And Moore said, even if there is nobody to appreciate the beauty of one or to be dismayed by the ugliness of the other, it's still better that the beautiful world should exist than that the ugly world should exist. And that just doesn't strike me as true at all, right? I think beauty is only of value if there are beings who can appreciate the beauty, and ugliness only matters if there are beings who can appreciate, or not appreciate, that's the wrong word, who are repelled by the ugliness.
Let's just have a follow-up question. Like, does it mean, like, if let's say I I'm a would-be poet. I'm considering whether to write a poem, although this
Drop your career. I would say just drop your career.
Okay.
Stop-
Yes,
stop
that's
your-
the question I
stop
want to
doing
ask
philosophy.
because we.
There
let's-
you've got the iPad there. Start scribbling some poetry.
It feels like when I considering whether to write a poem or whether I become a poet, like I have to calculate the expected value of like the happiness I can bring about of being a poet, and if I don't find it worthy, like the expected value is much lower than I do something else. It's sort of like kind of connected to the Linda example we've talked about last section, but it's more about personal choice now. We are not like trying to do good to others, but it's just trying to be a utilitarian. Does it mean that we, like just as the Linda case, we need to like just drop poetry and do something else, or perhaps be a banker, etc.?
I think it would depend, how strong your desire to do poetry is. If you have this creative urge and you think, I could be a poet and write worthwhile poems, maybe it's worth giving it a try, right? I don't know that I would abandon your lucrative career as a banker, and that might be a bit risky, but you could try writing poems over the weekend or something and see whether you have some talent for writing poetry, and if you did, maybe you would eventually hope to move in that direction. So I don't think it's a matter of trying to calculate. It's too hard, if you've never really written poetry but you have the thought that you could, it would be too hard to calculate whether you could be a great poet who would write wonderful poems. So I think probably to some extent we would say, if it's really making you unhappy that you're not getting time to write poems and you want to write poems, then sure, take a vacation from your job, try writing some poems, see how it works out. And when you know how good you are as a poet, you'll be in a better position to estimate whether perhaps you can contribute more to human well-being by writing poems than you can as a banker. It's possible, but you won't know until you know how good you are.
So can I further ask? So do you think it's really the case that everything will be instrumental value in order to get happiness? So you can really disregard the intrinsic value of the value we normally think they are intrinsically valuable, like the pursuit of truth, for example. Pursuit of truth, the mathematician living in the ivory tower, remote from the world, just want to provide some proof for some formula. At the end of the day, their pursuit of mathematical truth will not make any difference in the real world. So we will just say that, so they are doing something meaningless. Will you say that?
So someone would feel offended by your comment.
Well, they may be, but the
Peter
question
always
is whether the comments
people.
are right. Okay, so I mean, I think there have been some mathematical truths that at the time they were discovered and people pursued them, one might have said that's completely pointless. Yes, you've proved something, but it's irrelevant, won't make any difference to anyone's life. And then later on, somebody has come along with some applied problem, and actually that mathematical truth proved to be essential for an application which was greatly beneficial. I can't think of examples at the moment, but I believe there are some such examples. So it may be that it's worthwhile having people with great mathematical minds prove some things, because somewhere down the line it may become valuable and important. But if not, then I'm going to say, look, we have this sense of things having intrinsic value, and sometimes maybe it's a good thing. Maybe, go back to the sheriff case, maybe it's a good thing that we have this intuition that it's wrong for an officer of the law to fake evidence. And it's good that we have that intuition, because otherwise too many law officers will be faking things just because they think, oh, I know this guy's a bad person, but I can't really pin the crime on him, but I'll fake something up and then we can lock him away for a few years. And we don't want police or prosecutors to be doing that. So it's a good thing that we may believe that these things are of intrinsic value. but maybe they're not. And this, of course, does pose an interesting issue for utilitarians, because if it is good that we believe some things are of intrinsic value, like justice or truth or whatever, and here I am on this podcast now telling your viewers that it's not, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, right? Maybe
The
I
government house utilitarian comes again.
Yes, that's right. That's what Bernard Williams called. He objected to Sidgwick, who I think is actually the greatest of the utilitarian philosophers. We've talked about Bentham and we've talked about Mill. I think Henry Sidgwick is a much better philosopher than either Bentham or Mill.
Okay.
Not perhaps as creative and wide interest as Bentham, and didn't write a great essay on liberty like Mill did, or on the position of women. But a very careful, accurate philosopher, systematic philosopher. That's right. And he did talk explicitly about this idea of esoteric morality. That is, the idea that sometimes it might be right on utilitarian grounds not to say publicly what we know is the right thing to do. And Bernard Williams coined this famous phrase, government has morality, thinking of the Europeans in their white painted government house building somewhere in the colonies saying, well, really we ought to do this because it'll be for the benefit of us and the British Empire, but we won't tell the natives what we're doing. And even if they're really objectively thinking it's the best for everybody, including for the local people, we don't want to really tell them because they won't be able to understand it. They're not as sophisticated intellectuals like we are, and they won't be able to understand it. So, yes, I mean, there can be an abuse of esoteric morality, but I have defended Sidgwick on this in the book The Point of View of the Universe, which I co-authored with Katarzyna de Lazary-Radek, a Polish philosopher. And I think it's actually hard to deny that sometimes that is the right position to do. Well, one thing that's different, though, is that Sidgwick made this statement in a 500-page work of philosophy, which very few people were going to read, or the people who were going to read were going to be people who would appreciate the point. Now we talk about it in a podcast, and I'm sure your audience is also very sophisticated, but we do have wider audiences than Sidgwick ever did. And so there's a bit more of a paradox in talking about these things.
So can I put it in this way? So why we believe that pursuit of truth, pursuit of beauty is intrinsically valuable, because at the end it's consequentially beneficial.
Better that we should believe that.
So we have to make them to believe that they are intrinsically valuable, but actually they are not. Is it? Okay, so...
Should I continue on another objection
you can add one.
On the hedonism,
Yeah.
which is the very well-known experience machine objection that,
Yes.
that just use a couple of minutes, 1 minute to explain to the audience. I will do that. So suppose there is a experience simulating machine which can simulate any experience you would like to have. So you can simulate whatever you find pleasant, whatever make you happy. And it's interesting that this machine has a special feature, which is when people get into the machine, they forget that they are in the machine, that what they are experiencing is not real. So me, Cheng Nam, I'm standing in front of the machine, confronting a choice. Now, whether to get into the machine for the rest of my life, if I get into the machine, or everything I want to have, I can experience it. Maybe I want to be a well-known philosopher, I make contributions to philosophy, maybe just as Peter. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely in the real world, let's assume, I hope it's not the case, that I won't be able to do that, and I won't the utility or the happiness that I can bring about by staying in the real world is not as high as the utility I can bring about when I decide to go into the machine. So in this case, utilitarianism seems will say that yes, Cheng Nam, you should go into the machine because it's the best outcome we can have for the world. But it's a bit surprising because we normally will think oh, that's not real. You're just having the experience without really having those achievements. Like you are in the machine, you experience like to become a very famous philosopher, but you're not really a very famous philosopher. Like it seems like this suggestion suggests what is really important, what is really valuable is not the pleasure, not the experience, but the achievement itself. So that constitutes an objection to utilitarianism.
Yes, it does. It is an objection specifically to hedonistic utilitarianism, I think, because with preference utilitarianism, you can say, well, my preference is to be living in the real world and to know that I'm living in the real world. I also don't think it's a knockdown objection to hedonism. There's a number of reasons why I say that, but let me just take up one thing. In your example, you were suggesting that the pleasure that you would get by going into the machine would be greater than the pleasure or the suffering you can relieve, not only for you, but for everybody in the real world, right?
Yes.
Because if not, then a utilitarian will say, well, it's wrong to get in the machine because you're just an egoistic hedonist. You're just thinking of yourself if you get in the machine. Whereas if you don't get in the machine, you're a universal hedonist, which is what utilitarians are. That is, you want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for everyone.
Yeah. I think actually we can try sort of universalizing the example. Like this time the choice is not just whether I myself go into the machine, but whether we should build the machine, assume that's affordable,
Right.
in affordable cost, so that everyone can enter into the machine, just like the Matrix movies, like everyone in the machine, like so that like everyone can experience like the happy experience that there is no suffering anymore in the world.
How about animal suffering? So all the animals go into the machine as well, and really just imagine that they're eating the wonderful food or something, or
Yeah, if we can, or if not, at least like if all people get into those machines, like we can relieve a lot of animal suffering right now.
Well, I guess at least the humans will stop inflicting the immense amount of suffering that they're now inflicting on animals.
Yes.
But of course, there is also animal suffering in nature, which we're not relieving, but then we're not relieving it at the moment anyway. Maybe one day we could. Yeah, so I think I'm still going to bite the bullet and say, if in fact the machine is like this, and if it can produce more pleasure for everybody and less pain and suffering for everybody, that would be a good thing to do, to go into the machine. And this is also something that Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek and I discuss in The Point of View of the Universe, and we cite there the suggestion that it may be that the reason that we're reluctant to go in the machine is status quo bias. So psychologists have demonstrated that we are biased towards maintaining the situation we're in now, unless of course it's really intolerable. But in general, we're biased to maintaining the situation now rather than moving to a different situation which we're not familiar with, even if sort of the prospects of that situation are moving, the change is positive. And there's somebody called Felix de Brigade who did a study to try and test that. And he asked two different questions. One is, you describe the experience machine as you just described it, and you ask people, would you go into the experience machine or not? And most of them say no. And then you ask them a different question. You say, as it happens, you are now in the experience machine. And like in the Matrix, you have this, you can wake up and you have this moment, you can take the red or the blue pill, and if you take one of those pills, you'll go back into the experience machine. And if you take the other pill, you'll wake up and you'll no longer be in the experience machine, right? And so the life that that you thought was the real world, but is actually part of the experience machine, the people that you love and care for, the job that you have, all of those things, where you live, may completely change when you leave the experience machine. Would you leave it? And that does significantly affect the number of people who reject the experience machine, because now that you tell people that the life they're having is the experience machine, more of them are willing to stay. Whether it's more than half is another question. The study didn't have a really big sample, but I've asked that question a couple of times. I asked it in in Beijing, actually, in one of the talks that I gave. And there was definitely a significant increase in the show of hands when you asked the question the second time.
Yes. So I think the response is like why people refuse intuitively to go into the machine, not because Hinduism is wrong, just because they have the tendency or bias toward status quo. So I think this is one of the response to the experience machine from the point of view of a Hinduist. Yeah, so I think this segment come to the end. So we have discussed the objection and response about Hinduistic utilitarianism. So in the next segment, we will continue our philosophical discussion.
網友 Kelvin 潘話：喂，你哋呢段廣告好煩喎。Kelvin 明白嘅，唔中意嘅買咗佢咯，買咗我哋呢段 airtime 佢咯。你會不斷咁見到我嘅 by the way， 因為我哋又冇 budget， 又冇廣告，呢段就係我哋唯一嘅廣告。Kelvin， 我俾一個嘅建議俾你，唔中意嘅買咗我哋呢段時間佢，得唔得？ O 唔 OK？
Welcome back to our show. So last section we discussed the idea whether happiness or pleasure is the only thing that intrinsically matter to us. So in the last segment we will move to another objection, another dimension or implication of utilitarian, which concern human rights and animal rights. So would Mankey introduce the objection to us?
All right, let's start with human rights. For example, all right, now there are a lot of places in the world fighting wars, right? So, but let's say we are fighting a just war, all right, just for example, all right, and we capture some fighters from the other side. And normally we would say that they got their human rights as well, so that we shouldn't torture them. We shouldn't torture the captured soldiers. But from an utilitarian point of view, actually there may be lots of reasons for doing that, because if you torture a soldier from the other side fighting an unjust war, then you could deter other soldiers from fighting the unjust war, and it may actually bring an end to the war, because especially when they run out of soldier. But normally, all right, we would say that in order to retain our humanity, or in order to just avoid committing war crimes, we should respect their rights as well. We should never torture the soldier, even though they are actually fighting from the other side.
So I think the objection is like there are a lot of hypothetical or actual scenario in which you torture or violate the human right, but by doing that you can maximize the happiness. So you bring about the best consequence, like the trolley problem. So you can push the fat man off the bridge and then make him as a roadblock to save the 5 people, all those cases, pointing to the same intuition, which is we human being, we got moral right, and morality should respect our moral right, and we shouldn't be treated as a means. We are a being with dignity. So what do you think about this?
Well, I think it's very good that we have conventions about protecting rights and preventing war crimes. I think it's been hard work to try to get conventions between nations which establish some rules of war and rule out certain things as crimes, and I think that has probably saved an immense amount of suffering. So I would not lightly discard those, but I can certainly, again, imagine at least hypothetical circumstances in which you would do more good. The problem is, though, especially in a war situation, you've always got to think if you start torturing your captive, prisoners of war, then the other side is going to do that to your soldiers as well. So I think you don't want to do something that will create a breakdown in those circumstances. For me, the more plausible hypothetical about torture is the terrorist who has planted the nuclear bomb in a big city and the only way you can get him to tell you where the bomb is by torturing him. And if you don't torture him, then the bomb will go off in a few hours, and you can't evacuate the city, such a big city, in that time, so perhaps millions of people will die. So I don't think these human rights are absolute, and in those imaginary circumstances anyway, I would say we're justified in violating them, but I would not really want to just regard the conventions of human rights as something that's meaningless or that we can lightly push aside.
So again, it's like the government of utilitarians, so we have to tell the people, we have to respect the right.
Yes, we
So
should
in
certainly
order to-
tell the officers. I mean, look, we saw this very plainly in Iraq, right? When the US was revealed that the US were torturing prisoners in Abu Ghraib, the prison that they set up, and you know, there was no real evidence that incredibly valuable information was coming out. I think when you get prisoners and you get prison guards who are in power over them, sometimes those prison guards have a sadistic streak, or they like to just, you know, harm these people. They start to see them as subhuman, and I think that's a terrible thing, and it will happen. It definitely will happen if we don't have strict rules against torture, which you would only want to violate if you were absolutely sure that this was the only way to prevent some real disaster.
So what about the fat man version of the trolley problem? Because the fat man would be a better candidate because he's innocent compared with the terrorist or the soldier might be Bing Murphy. So will you also say that, okay, we should push him off the bridge to save the 5 people?
Again, if in this case, I would, and it's interesting, I think, that, you know, there's 2 versions of the trolley problem. There's the version where you're standing by a switch, and the only way to save the 5 is to throw the switch, and the trolley will run down the side branch line and kill 1. And most people think that's okay. You should throw the switch, or at least it's permissible to throw the switch. And yet the fat man case is just the same, except that instead of throwing a switch, you have to actually push him off this bridge. And Josh Green, who started out his career in philosophy but then became a professor of psychology, has done research that suggests that we have this intuitive response to hands-on violence, and that's an evolved response because for you know, hundreds of thousands of years we could harm other people by this hands-on violence, and so we evolved this response to say no, that's bad, whereas we didn't have the possibility of killing people by throwing a switch. That's very recent, and so that isn't an evolved response. And I think that's a plausible explanation for what's otherwise rather puzzling, why people are prepared to say, yes, it's permissible to throw the switch, but no, it's not permissible to push the heavy person off the bridge.
So again, you try to explain your way the
Yeah, I explain, because I'm not really moved by these intuitions. I think that many people are too prone to accept their instinctive reactions, and those instinctive reactions may be evolved responses like this one that are no longer really applicable to the present world, or they may be a result of culture or religion or early education. I don't think they're a very reliable guide to what we really ought to do.
So if we move to the issue of animal ethics, do you think human beings in general should be given any special moral status or moral right compared with the animal because they are just sentient beings like us?
Well, let me put it this way. If you think that all human beings, irrespective of their capacities, have rights that no non-human animals have, I think it's very difficult to justify that because, after all, there are some non-human animals whose capacities to talk or to reason, to be self-aware, to be a moral agent, are superior to those of some human beings. Infants, for example, none of us had those capacities when we were infants, maybe people with profound intellectual disabilities. But the idea that all of these humans are somehow morally superior in status to any non-human animal, whether it's a chimpanzee or an elephant or a dog or a pig or a chicken or a fish, I don't see, that just seems to me speciesism. It just seems to be doing the same as what racists do when they say, yes, all white people have a status that is superior to that of all black people. And you know, people actually did think that during the time of the slavery, they seemed to think that. So I think we're doing something similar between species.
I want to follow up a question regarding like human rights and animal rights, because like I'm not sure, but like Peter, your point of view seems like we can have human rights as a fiction, a useful fiction, a utilitarian rights, useful fiction for ordinary people. But what about animal rights? Because I think like more theoretically sensitive people may sense a difference between advocating animal rights and just advocating animal welfare. So some people may say like animals don't have rights. I'm not sure what they will say about the human case. Maybe human rights is like, it's not really there too.
Yeah.
But there is no animal rights. What we care about is actually animal welfare, so that when we can be sure that like killing this chicken and eat it will not cause like immense suffering, or to the extent that we, like the pleasure we have by eating them being outweighed by the suffering inflicted. In that case, like there's no right for the chicken, so we can just kill it and eat it, just like that. So if like your response to human rights as a fiction is a good one, so isn't it like we can say the same thing about animal rights? We actually, a utilitarian should advocate animal rights and not just animal welfare.
So, I mean, I don't, as we've been saying, I think that rights are a useful convention sometimes, but I don't ground my ethics on the idea of rights. And when it comes to animals, again, I don't ground my view about the moral status of animals on this notion of rights. I ground it on the principle of equal consideration of similar interests, which I think is a utilitarian principle. You give the same weight to pain as in one person as you give to pain in another person, and you give the same weight to pain in a non-human animal as you give to a similar kind of pain in a human being. Should we have a sort of fiction of animal rights? I don't know. I mean, I think it's probably less useful because it's harder to convince people, at least at this stage, that there are rights. Maybe at some point society will change and we will want to talk about rights. I did join something called the Great Ape Project, which suggested that we should attribute rights to life, liberty and protection from torture to great apes. That was an attempt to sort of make the argument again, why should all humans have these rights, but even our closest relatives, the chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, should not have these rights, very basic rights. So I'm not in principle opposed to the idea of declarations of rights for animals, but I do think there's this sort of simpler principle that people can more easily understand. And incidentally, in the case you mentioned of the chicken, talking about equal consideration of interest, I think it's easier to see that if you consider the interests of a chicken at all, then particularly a factory farm chicken who's lived its entire life in miserable, crowded conditions, has a much greater interest in not living that life at all than you have in the meal that you might get out of the chicken.
Okay, but I want to make a follow-up question, because I think at some point an animal rights advocate are forced to compare human rights to animal rights. For example, in some medical research, we actually kill some maybe chimpanzee or maybe some great.
Probably not chimpanzees anymore. They're generally not used for
or
medical
other
research.
kinds of mammals.
Certainly other mammals, yes.
In order to do the medical research in order to save more human lives, and I have heard that you think at some point it's acceptable, but that's really offends some animal rights advocates, because for them, well, if it's not okay, if it's unacceptable for us to do this kind of research on human children, why we could ever do this thing to animals, do this thing to those mammals? it seems like for them, or maybe simply another philosopher, Tom Regan, or it's speciesist. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So Tom Regan was a friend of mine, but we certainly differed on this point. I mean, we agreed on the criticism of speciesism. We agreed that the moral status of animals should be much higher than it is in the world today. But he was an absolute abolitionist about animal experiments. He thought animal experiments are not justified, even if they are, well designed to save lives, a large number of lives, and it's just a small number of experiments. He thought it was wrong. As a utilitarian, I can't say that, and I don't want to say that. I think you can justify some experiments. You try to minimize all the harm that you inflict on animals. You use the smallest number that you can to get valid scientific results. You make their lives as comfortable as possible outside the actual experiment. But if this experiment is going to save thousands or tens of thousands of lives on a small number of animals under those circumstances, I would have to say that that's a justifiable thing to do.
But do you think in these circumstances it's really difficult to calculate the expected value? Because we just like the pursuit of mathematical truth.
Right.
They may be useful in the future, but the experiment on non-human animal, it's really difficult to judge, to calculate the expected value. So how can we decide whether we should do those things on the rat or other mammals now? So
Yeah, I want to add like a concern, because some people may think that like the progress of science, like of research, is proceeded just in this way, because like in a lot of cases, if we are considering like physics, like we invest a lot of like resources, money to do a lot of experiments. Maybe most of them are useless at the end. But
just like our papers and philosophical article, but
well,
might be a very small portion of them.
well, we just
Well, we only waste our time and the effort of getting them published, but we don't inflict suffering on others.
just on ourselves. But if like physics is proceeded in this way, and that's the only path to a real breakthrough.
Yeah.
So why not like a research on like medical experiment, like new medicines for some like previously incurable diseases can be proceeded in this way? So some people may argue in this case, it's a kind of like calculating the expected value, but at least it justifies some of our experiments, no matter how inhumane it seems to animals.
Well, it doesn't justify them no matter how inhumane they seem, unless somehow you just cannot do this work and make it more humane, right? Because always the question is, are you minimizing the suffering of the animal as far as possible, compatible with getting useful results? And generally speaking, I think that we don't make serious efforts to minimize research. In fact, one of the papers that I gave, one of the talks I gave in the tour of China, I talked about the fact that in China, to obtain blood for medical research, there's a horrible procedure called eye enucleation, which is done on mice, and basically you squeeze the eyeball out of the mouse, the fully conscious mouse, and take blood from behind it, and you more or less drain the mouse of blood, which the mouse then dies. But it's not anesthetized to do this, and this is not done elsewhere. I presume it's not done in Hong Kong. It's done in mainland China, as far as I know, only there. And there's just no effort really to minimize the suffering of the animal that goes on there. So this is the real problem, that there isn't enough effort made to reduce the pain and suffering of animals, because they're just not counted sufficiently in terms of their status.
So in speaking of reducing the suffering of the non-human animals, I have one last question. I'm curious about your view about the suffering in the natural world. So you mentioned in our show and also yesterday talk, the suffering of the wildlife in the natural world. So I read a paper from John Merman in New York Times. He said that he, as a utilitarian, support the idea that we should genetically modify the wildlife into something else which do not eat meat. So they turn the carnivore to the herbivore. So what? And actually, I make a video on this YouTube channel years before to introduce the article, and all the comments on the video think, oh no, the utilitarians are all crazy people. So what do you think? Should we also reduce the natural suffering of the wildlife?
Well, I mean, there's some natural suffering of wildlife that we can reduce. For example, we can have bird-friendly glass so that birds don't crash into the windows of our buildings and kill themselves. That's reducing wildlife suffering. But I don't think that we can at present transform predators into herbivores. And obviously many people who value biodiversity and the preservation of a natural ecology, and I don't think the animal movement should get into a headlong conflict with them when there's so much human-inflicted suffering on animals, particularly in factory farming, that really we should deal with first. The other point is that it's not only predators and carnivores that cause suffering in nature, it's also the method of reproduction that has evolved in many species of producing hundreds or even thousands of offspring each year, of which on average only 2 are going to survive to maturity, because otherwise the species would be multiplying hugely. And the others die, and many of them maybe die from starvation or they're tadpoles living in a pond that dries up in the summer when there's no rain and they just die. So nature is pretty cruel, and perhaps at some stage in the distant future we'll find ways of making it less painful for animals, but as you say, that's not a priority for me at present.
But you theoretically believe that the natural suffering is just carrying the same moral weight with the artificial suffering of the non-human animal.
Yes, it's suffering. I mean, again, there's no agent to blame for the suffering of nature. Evolution is not an agent, and we were not created by a divine creator who set all this suffering in motion. Whereas there are agents to blame for the suffering of animals in factory farms. But the suffering itself is just as bad, whether it's caused by a human or whether it's caused by nature. It's the degree of suffering that matters, not who caused it or how it was caused.
Thank you. So I think we are coming to the end of today. So thank you so much for sharing your view on different kind of issues like animal, utilitarian. We learn a lot. And I think on those issues, maybe we may agree or disagree, but I think your work reminds us one important thing is that philosophy is not just abstract ideas. Absolutely. It is really relevant to our world, to our life. We can gain from your insight to rethink our moral responsibility and how can we make the world a better place to live. So at the end, I know that Peter Singer has also got a podcast, right? So would you mind to introduce to our audience Peter's podcast?
Thank you very much. Yes, I do a podcast called Lives Well Lived. I do it together with the woman I mentioned who's been a co-author of a couple of my books, Kasia de Lazari Radic. And you can find Lives Well Lived wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just Google it and you'll find it. We've had a lot of really interesting guests that we've interviewed, people like Yuval Harari, Jane Goodall, Daniel Kahneman, Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you're interested in the universe and what he has to say about ethics. We're talking about what it is to live well, and that's obviously relevant to the questions about hedonism that you've been asking me, and also practical, I think. So it's a combination of philosophy, practical philosophy, and different views from different people relevant to how we live well.
Yep. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
It's really an honor today to explore your view on different issues. So I feel excellent today. So we have done our job. So let's keep your eye on our show. We will be continuing doing philosophy. So see you next time. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Jiman, Mankei, Chang Nong. Thank you all.